They say beauty can be a blessing or a curse. For Celia, it was a weapon she never chose to wield. Bought at 17 by Josiah Marrow, a master who saw her not as human, but as his legacy, she was forced to bear him 12 children, each one taken from her arms before they could even say her name. For years she smiled when told to, obeyed when ordered, and watched the house built on her suffering grow fat with wealth. But the day her eldest son was whipped to death for calling her Mama, something in her broke. By night, the servants saw candles flicker in the windows, and the smell of herbs drift through the halls. By dawn, the mistress lay cold in her bed, and the master's cries rose with the smoke. They thought she'd been broken. They never imagined she was waiting. Because when a woman's womb has been turned into a grave, the only thing left she can give birth to is vengeance. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The auction block in Savannah stood like an altar to greed, baking beneath the Georgia sun. 17-year-old Celia kept her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the crowd, trying to make herself invisible despite standing before all. Her skin prickled with sweat and shame as strange men examined her teeth, felt her arms, commented on her hips. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square. "Fine young woman here. Strong back, gentle disposition. Perfect for household duties," the crowd murmured. Celia knew what they saw. Not a person, but a possession. Her beauty was not a blessing, but a curse that made men's eyes linger too long. At the edge of the crowd stood Josiah Marrow, his cane tapping impatiently against polished boots. His face was handsome in the way of men who have never heard the word no. Smooth cheeks above a neat beard, eyes that calculated value with every glance. Beside him stood his wife, Eleanor, her face hidden behind a fine lace veil, her gloved hands clenched into tight fists. $500, called a voice from the crowd. 600, Josiah countered, not bothering to raise his hand, his voice carrying the certainty of wealth. The bidding continued. With each increase, Eleanor's shoulders stiffened further beneath her expensive shawl. When Josiah finally won with $900, a price that made the crowd whistle, Eleanor turned away so sharply that her veil fluttered in the hot air. Celia was led from the platform with a chain around her wrist. As she passed Eleanor, she caught the flash of pale eyes behind the veil, eyes burning with such hatred that Celia quickly lowered her gaze. "You've bought another mouth to feed," Eleanor said, her voice tight as a drum. "I've invested in quality help," Josiah replied smoothly. "The house needs fresh hands." Eleanor laughed, a brittle sound like breaking glass. "The house? Of course." The journey to Marrow Plantation took hours in a jolting wagon. Celia sat in the back with 3 other newly purchased people, all avoiding each other's eyes. The Marrows rode ahead in their fine carriage, the distance between master and property clearly marked. When they arrived, Celia saw a white mansion gleaming like a tooth against green fields that stretched toward the horizon. Behind it stood rows of wooden cabins where smoke curled from chimneys. A gray-haired black woman with kind eyes and a stern mouth was waiting by the kitchen door. She wore a clean apron over a faded dress, a red scarf wrapped around her head. "This is Miriam," Josiah said, barely looking at the older woman. "She'll show you your duties." As soon as the Marrows disappeared inside, Miriam's formal posture relaxed. She looked Celia up and down, her eyes seeing everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the bruises on Celia's wrists from the chains. "Come, child," she said quietly. "Let's get you settled." Miriam led her to a small room off the kitchen where a thin pallet lay in the corner. "You sleep here, close to the house for early morning duties." "What kind of duties?" Celia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miriam's face showed nothing, but her eyes held ancient sorrow. "Whatever the master requires," she said. "I'm the midwife here. Been delivering babies for 30 years." She paused. "All kinds of babies." Before Celia could ask what she meant, a tall man appeared at the doorway carrying firewood. His arms were muscled from hard labor, but his eyes held a quiet intelligence that surprised her. "This is Jonas," Miriam said. "He works the fields, but helps in the house sometimes." Jonas nodded slightly. "Welcome to Marrow," he said, his voice low and careful, though welcome isn't the right word. That evening, Miriam showed Celia how to prepare the bedrooms, how to turn down sheets, and which floors needed scrubbing. The work was hard but simple. Celia followed instructions carefully, hoping that obedience might offer some protection. As darkness fell, Miriam touched her arm gently. "Lock your door tonight," she whispered, "though locks don't always help in this house." Celia did as she was told, sliding the small bolt across her door before collapsing onto her pallet. Her muscles ached from the day's labor, and tears threatened to spill from her eyes. She thought of her mother, sold 3 years earlier, whose last words had been, "Stay strong, no matter what." She had almost drifted to sleep when she heard the scrape of a key in her lock. The bolt slid back. The door opened. Josiah Marrow stood in the doorway, lamplight catching on his smooth face. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "My dear Celia," he said softly, "I've come to properly welcome you to your new home." Celia pressed herself against the wall, but there was nowhere to run. The small room suddenly felt like a trap. "Please," she whispered, "I need to rest. For tomorrow's work." Josiah closed the door behind him. "This is tomorrow's work," he said, placing the lamp on the floor. "And all the tomorrows after." The night stretched endlessly. Celia retreated deep inside herself as Josiah claimed what he considered his property. She fixed her eyes on a crack in the ceiling, counting the seconds, minutes, hours, until he finished. When he finally left, the first gray light of dawn was seeping through her small window. She did not cry. Something inside her had frozen solid, turning grief to ice. Morning light spilled across the plantation, painting the fields gold. Celia sat on the edge of her pallet, clutching her torn dress around her shoulders. Her body ached. Her mind felt distant, as if watching herself from far away. Outside her door, she heard Josiah whistling a cheerful tune as he strode toward the main house for breakfast. The sound cut through her like a knife. The door opened slightly, and the housekeeper, an older woman Celia had briefly met yesterday, peered in. Her eyes widened slightly at Celia's state, then narrowed with understanding and pity. "Get dressed, girl," she murmured, placing a clean dress on the bed. "The master's got a new pet. But even pets have chores." The breakfast table at Marrow Plantation gleamed with fine china and silver that caught the morning light. Eleanor sat at one end, her back straight as a rod, while Josiah lounged at the head, scanning a newspaper. Neither spoke. The only sounds were the clink of silverware and the soft padding of feet as Celia moved around the table, pouring coffee with trembling hands. "More toast, my dear?" Josiah asked, not looking up from his paper. Eleanor's lips thinned. "No, thank you." Celia stepped forward to refill Josiah's cup. As she leaned over, his hand brushed against hers, a touch too deliberate to be accident. Eleanor saw it. Her teacup clattered against its saucer. "The new girl seems clumsy," Eleanor said, her voice sharp as a blade. "Perhaps she needs more training before serving at table." "On the contrary," Josiah replied, finally looking at his wife. "I find her quite skilled for one so new." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Don't you agree?" Celia kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her face a careful mask that hid the storm inside. She had learned quickly that the less they saw of her true self, the safer she might be. "The linens need washing today," Eleanor said to Celia, ignoring her husband. "And the pantry needs counting. I expect you to finish both before supper." "Yes, ma'am," Celia whispered, stepping back into the shadows. "You're overwhelming the girl, Eleanor," Josiah said. "She's still learning our ways." "Our ways?" Eleanor laughed that brittle laugh again. "Or your ways, husband." The rest of breakfast passed in tense silence. When it ended, Eleanor swept from the room without another word. Josiah lingered, watching Celia gather the dishes. "Don't mind my wife," he said, rising from his chair. "She forgets her Christian charity sometimes." He moved closer, trapping her between his body and the table. "The good book tells us that servants should obey their masters in everything. Do you understand, Celia?" "Yes, master," she answered, her voice soft but hollow. "The Lord has placed you here for a purpose," he continued, his hand now resting on her shoulder. "Just as Abraham had Hagar, I too must ensure my lineage continues." His fingers tightened. "It is God's will." That night, and many nights after, Josiah came to her room with Bible verses on his lips and cruelty in his hands. Each time, Celia retreated further into herself, building walls inside her mind where she could hide. The days blurred together in a rhythm of work and terror. Celia learned the routines of the house, when to be visible and when to disappear, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to move silently through rooms where Eleanor might be watching. Miriam became her quiet guide, teaching her which herbs could ease pain, which could bring sleep. Jonas slipped her scraps of paper with letters drawn on them, teaching her to read in stolen moments behind the kitchen garden. "Knowledge is freedom," he whispered once. "Even when your body ain't free, your mind can be." Within a year of her arrival, Celia's belly swelled with child. Eleanor watched with cold fury as Josiah proudly announced to visitors that his investment was proving fruitful. "God has blessed our household," he proclaimed at dinner one evening, while Eleanor stabbed at her food with unusual force. The birth was hard. Celia labored for 20 hours, with only Miriam to help her through the pain. When her son finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Celia felt a love so fierce it terrified her. "Joseph," Josiah declared when he saw the boy, "after the favored son in Scripture." For 2 precious weeks, Celia held her baby, nursing him in the quiet hours, memorizing the perfect curve of his ear, the tiny wrinkles on his knuckles. Then, one morning, she woke to find his cradle empty. "Where is my baby?" she cried, rushing through the house in panic. "Where is Joseph?" It was Miriam who finally told her the truth, pulling her into the herb garden where no one could hear them speak. "Mrs. Marrow sold him," Miriam said, her old face lined with sorrow. "Trader came before dawn. Took him to Charleston, they said." Celia collapsed against the garden wall, a sound like a dying animal tearing from her throat. Miriam held her, rocking her like a child. "Hush, now," she whispered. "Strength is all we got. You'll need it for what's to come." Years passed. The seasons changed from planting to harvest, again and again. Celia's body, once young and strong, grew worn from labor and childbirth. Yet something in her mind hardened, growing sharp and watchful. Every year or so, her belly would swell, and another child would come into the world. Some she managed to keep for months, others for mere weeks. Josiah named them all: Joseph, Mary, Isaiah, Ruth, speaking of God's blessings while using Scripture to justify his sins. 12 children in all, 12 pieces of her heart torn away. Eleanor never softened. If anything, her hatred grew more focused, more deliberate. She created impossible tasks, found fault where there was none, and, most cruelly, ensured that every child born of Celia's body disappeared when Josiah was away on business. "A fever took the child," she would say. Or, "The infant was too weak to thrive." Josiah would rage, but never at Eleanor. Instead, his anger fell on Celia. as if her body had failed him rather than his wife's schemes. 5 years after her arrival at Marrow Plantation, Celia was cleaning the unused rooms in the East Wing when she found it. In a trunk filled with old linens was a small shawl, one she had embroidered herself for Joseph. Her fingers had shakily stitched his initials, J.M., in one corner. Now that corner was stiff with something dark and brown. Blood. Celia lifted the shawl to her face, inhaling deeply. Beneath the musty smell of the trunk, she caught the faintest trace of the lavender oil she had dabbed on her firstborn's skin. Her legs gave way. She sank to the floor, the shawl clutched to her chest, as the truth she had suspected but never confirmed crashed over her. Her children had not died. They had not been buried in the small cemetery beyond the orchard where Eleanor had claimed they rested. They had been sold like cattle, like sacks of grain, like the property Josiah claimed they were. In that moment, something in Celia's heart turned to stone. The tears that fell from her eyes would be the last she shed from grief alone. From now on, she would save her tears for another purpose, one that would take years to fulfill, but would come as surely as harvest follows planting. Night had fallen over Marrow Plantation, wrapping the buildings in shadows. Celia stumbled toward the stables, the blood-stained shawl clutched in her trembling hands. The truth burned inside her, a fire that threatened to consume everything. Jonas was mending a bridle when she appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wild with grief. "Child, what's happened?" He set down his work, glancing nervously toward the main house. Before she could answer, Miriam emerged from the shadows. The old woman took one look at Celia and the shawl in her hands, and understanding dawned in her weathered face. "You found it," Miriam said, her voice barely above a whisper. Celia nodded, unable to speak through the knot in her throat. "Come." Miriam took her elbow gently. "Not here. The walls have ears, even in the dark." They slipped behind the stables to a small clearing where the sweet smell of hay mingled with night jasmine. The moon cast just enough light for them to see each other's faces. Jonas followed silently, keeping watch. "My babies," Celia finally choked out, unfolding the bloodied shawl. "She sold them. She told me they died, but she sold them." "Yes," Miriam confirmed, taking Celia's hands in her own. "Mrs. Marrow sells them to traders who come at dawn. The master never knows until it's too late." "But why the blood?" Celia asked, her voice breaking. Jonas spoke then, his deep voice soft with anger. "To make the story of their deaths seem true. A chicken's blood, most likely. Just enough to convince Master Josiah when he returns from his trips." Celia sank to her knees in the dirt, clutching the shawl to her chest. "I'll never see them again." "No," Miriam said plainly, "and that's the truth many mothers here face." "But you ain't finished yet, girl." Celia looked up, confusion mixing with her grief. "You still breathin'," Miriam continued, kneeling despite her old bones. "Long as you breathe, you got choices. Small ones, maybe, but they're yours." "What choices?" Celia asked bitterly. "I'm property, just like my children." "Knowledge," Jonas said, crouching beside them. "They can own your body, but not what's in here." He tapped his temple. "Not unless you let them." Miriam nodded. "I've been on this land for 40 years, seen 3 generations of Marrows. They think they know everything that happens here." A small, defiant smile crossed her face. "They don't." Something stirred in Celia then, a tiny spark amid the ashes of her heart. "Teach me," she whispered. "Teach me everything." Miriam's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "I will teach you herbs, which heal and which harm, which bring sleep and which bring silence. And I'll teach you letters," Jonas added, "so you can read their words and know their secrets." Celia looked from one face to the other, these two who had survived decades of bondage, yet somehow kept their souls intact. "Why would you risk yourselves for me?" Miriam touched Celia's cheek gently. "Because every chain broken makes us all a little freer. That night marked the beginning of Celia's education. 3 times a week, she would slip away to meet Miriam in the herb garden, learning to identify plants by smell and touch in the darkness. "Foxglove," Miriam would say, guiding Celia's fingers to feel the soft, velvety leaves. "Beautiful flower. Stops a heart if used wrong, or right, depending on your need. This is deadly nightshade," she explained on another night. "A drop in tea brings sleep. More than that, brings the long sleep." Miriam taught her which herbs could heal cuts, ease pain, bring on monthly bleeding, or stop it. Knowledge passed down through generations, whispered from mother to daughter, preserved despite everything meant to erase it. Jonas taught her in different ways. On scraps of paper and in the dirt, he showed her letters and words. They began with simple marks and sounds, progressing to small words. "This here is your name," he said one evening, scratching Celia in the dust behind the smokehouse. Celia traced the letters with her finger, feeling a strange power in seeing herself made visible in this new way. "My name," she repeated, committing each curve and line to memory. Months passed, then years. Celia's skills grew alongside her burden of grief. Her body continued to serve Josiah's cruel purpose, bearing child after child, only to lose them all. But her mind became her own secret kingdom. By her 3rd year of learning, Celia could read simple passages from the Bible Jonas kept hidden in the stables. By the 5th year, she could decipher the ledgers in Josiah's study when she cleaned. It was there she found the final proof, columns of numbers and names, her children listed as property alongside cotton yields and livestock. Joseph, age 2 weeks, sold to J. Williams, Charleston. $100. Mary, age 3 months, sold to P. Thompson, Atlanta. $150. Isaiah, age 1 year, sold to G. Bennett, Savannah. $300. The careful penmanship, the precise figures. Eleanor's handwriting recording the sale of her husband's bastards, as she called them. Behind the smokehouse, in a small patch of earth where no one ever looked, Celia created her own record. For each child, she buried a scrap of cloth with their initials embroidered by her own hand. 12 small bundles in all, arranged in a circle. Not graves, for her children weren't dead, but markers of remembrance. Seasons turned. Springs came with their sweet scents and hope, summers with their brutal heat, autumns with harvest, and winters with their brief respite from fieldwork. Through it all, Celia's body continued its cycle of pregnancy, birth, and loss. By her late 20s, she had borne 12 children in 16 years. Her once youthful face now showed lines of sorrow. Her hands had grown calloused from labor, yet something had changed within her. Where once there had been only fear and grief, now burned a steady flame of purpose. Each night, she whispered her children's names like a prayer, committing to memory every detail she had managed to learn about where they had been sent. One morning, as dawn broke over the fields, Celia stood at the window of the laundry room, watching wagons roll down the road toward Savannah. She wondered, as she often did, if one of her children might be on such a wagon, being moved from one master to another. "I will find you," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Somehow, someday, I will find you all." The sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, a beauty that seemed to mock the ugliness of human cruelty. But Celia drew strength from it nonetheless. Another day alive meant another day to learn, to remember, to plan. As light spilled across the plantation, she turned from the window. There was work to be done, knowledge to be gathered, and somewhere in the future, a reckoning to be faced. The clatter of carriage wheels on the gravel drive drew Celia to the window. Josiah had been gone for 3 days on business in Savannah, and his returns always brought changes to the rhythm of the house. Some small, some that altered everything. This time, she saw something that made her heart stop. Two boys stepped down from the carriage, their skin lighter than hers but darker than Josiah's. One stood tall and proud despite his youth, perhaps 10 years old. The other, seemingly the same age but smaller, kept his eyes downcast. Both wore clean but simple clothes, better than field hands but marking them as servants. Josiah placed a hand on each boy's shoulder, guiding them toward the house. Even from a distance, Celia could see the way he looked at them, with that particular pride he reserved for things he considered his finest possessions. She gripped the windowsill to steady herself. Those were her features looking back at her. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones, the set of their shoulders. These were her sons. "Celia!" Eleanor's sharp voice cut through her shock. "Stop gawking and prepare the small room near the kitchen. The masters brought back new houseboys." Celia turned, struggling to keep her face blank. "Yes, ma'am." She moved mechanically through the house, preparing the narrow room where the boys would sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Which births were they from? The third and fourth, perhaps? She had given birth to twins once. Could these be them? Or were they from separate pregnancies, brought together by some cruel twist of fate? An hour later, she stood in the kitchen as Josiah presented the boys to the household staff. "This is William," he said, indicating the smaller, gentler-looking boy. "And this is Henry." The taller boy met everyone's gaze boldly, a flicker of defiance in his eyes that made Celia's heart clench with both pride and fear. "They'll be trained as house servants," Josiah continued. "William will work primarily indoors, and Henry will assist with the stables and errands. Treat them accordingly." His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on Celia. She kept her gaze lowered, fighting to control her breathing. Did he know? Was this some twisted game? Bringing her children back to serve in the house where they were born? "Celia," Josiah said, making her start. "You'll show them their duties." "Yes, Master Josiah," she replied, her voice mercifully steady. The boys followed her through the house as she explained their tasks, polishing silver, carrying trays, running messages. William listened attentively, his gentle nature evident in how carefully he handled each object she showed him. Henry's attention seemed to drift, his eyes constantly moving, studying exits and entrances, measuring distances. "You'll rise before dawn," she told them quietly as they reached the kitchen, "and work until after dinner is cleared. Remember to—" She stopped, suddenly unable to continue, as Henry looked directly at her. Her own eyes stared back at her from her son's face. "Ma'am?" William asked, his voice soft and concerned. "Are you well?" Celia swallowed hard. "Yes, just tired." She forced herself to continue. "Remember to speak only when spoken to. Keep your eyes down when the master or mistress addresses you." "Why?" Henry challenged, his voice low but fierce. Celia glanced around quickly, relieved to find the kitchen momentarily empty. She leaned closer to the boys. "Because it keeps you safe," she whispered, "and safety is what matters most." The weeks that followed were a special kind of torture. Celia watched her sons move through the house, learning their duties, growing familiar with the rhythms of Marrow Plantation. She observed them hungrily, collecting details like precious jewels. William's habit of humming softly while he worked, Henry's quick mind and quicker hands, the way they both tilted their heads the same way when listening. She protected them in small ways. When Henry spilled ink on the library carpet, Celia appeared with a solution that removed the stain before Eleanor discovered it. When William broke a teacup, she diverted attention by dropping a stack of linens. She taught them shortcuts through their duties, warned them of Eleanor's moods, showed them which foods could be safely taken from the kitchen when hunger gnawed at their growing bodies, all while keeping the devastating truth locked behind her teeth. Eleanor noticed. Celia caught her watching with narrowed eyes one afternoon as she showed William how to properly fold napkins, her hand briefly touching his. "You seem unusually interested in the new boys," Eleanor remarked later that day, her voice deceptively casual. "They're quick learners, ma'am," Celia replied, keeping her face expressionless. "Makes my work easier when they know their tasks." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "Indeed. Though Henry seems to have quite the willful streak, perhaps too much coddling would be unwise." The threat hung in the air between them. Celia understood its meaning perfectly. Eleanor suspected something, and Henry would bear the consequences of any misstep. Celia became more careful after that, limiting her interactions with the boys when others might see. But in small moments, passing in hallways, working side by side in the kitchen, she found ways to show them kindness that wouldn't draw attention. One evening, as the house settled into night, Celia brought fresh linens to the boys' small room. William sat on his bed, while Henry stood at the tiny window, staring out at the darkness. "You should both be asleep," she said softly, setting down the bundle. William looked up at her, his face open and curious in the candlelight. "Why do you look at us that way?" he asked suddenly. Celia felt her heart stumble. "What way?" "Like you're trying to memorize our faces," he said. "Like you're afraid we'll disappear." Henry turned from the window, his eyes sharp and assessing in a way no child's should be. He didn't speak, but his gaze asked the same question. Celia's throat tightened. These were her sons, her flesh, her blood. Every instinct screamed for her to gather them in her arms, to tell them the truth, to claim them as her own. But that truth would destroy them all. She forced a smile instead, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. "Because you remind me of someone I once knew." The candlelight flickered over her face, catching the wetness in her eyes before she could turn away. In the silence that followed, she felt Henry's gaze boring into her back, searching for the truth she couldn't give him. Not yet. 4 seasons came and went, marking time in the way all things at Marrow Plantation were measured, by planting and harvest, by profit and loss. The cotton stood high again, then bent beneath the weight of its own bounty. Men and women stooped in the fields from dawn until dusk, their backs curved like question marks against the sky. Celia, now 33, moved through the great house with quiet authority. Her beauty had softened with age and hardship, the sharpness of youth giving way to something weathered yet enduring, like a stone shaped by persistent water. Josiah no longer came to her room at night. His appetite had turned toward younger women recently purchased from the auction blocks in Savannah. She did not mourn this change. The fading of her beauty granted her a different kind of freedom, to observe, to listen, to plan. Josiah now trusted her with the running of his household, with the storeroom keys that hung heavy at her waist, with the management of younger servants, including her sons, William and Henry, who had grown taller in the passing seasons. "Mind the blue jar on the top shelf," Miriam told her one afternoon in the still room where herbs hung drying from the rafters. "That's blackroot. A spoonful cleanses the blood." More than that, the old woman's eyes met hers meaningfully. "I understand," Celia said, committing the location to memory. She knew which herbs healed and which hurt, which eased pain and which ended it forever. She kept her own small garden behind the cookhouse, growing mint and rosemary that masked the bitterness of other things. No one questioned this. It was expected that the head housekeeper would grow seasonings for the master's table. The rattling of the storeroom keys became a comfort, a promise. She learned the properties of lamp oils, how some burned clean while others smoked and caught, which woods rotted fastest after rain, which doors swelled in summer heat, and which could be opened silently after midnight. Jonas, now working as a driver with occasional trips to the docks in Savannah, brought her whispered news and sometimes letters, folded scraps of paper carried by sympathetic sailors or freedmen working the coastal ships. 3 made it north, he told her one evening behind the smokehouse, his voice barely audible above the chirp of crickets. Philadelphia? Can't know which one's for certain, but the man who passed the word says they're well. Learning trades. Celia pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes closing briefly against the pain and hope that twisted together in her chest. "My children?" she whispered. "Free." Jonas nodded, his weathered face solemn in the fading light. The others? He shook his head slightly, still looking, still asking. She nodded, accepting the uncertain fate of the rest. 9 still lost to her, scattered like seeds across plantations from Virginia to Louisiana, or perhaps lying in unmarked graves, or perhaps, like these 3, breathing free air somewhere beyond her reach. William and Henry remained close, their presence both balm and wound. She watched them grow, William becoming thoughtful and careful, Henry's fire burning just beneath the surface of his obedience. Neither knew the truth, though sometimes she caught Henry studying her face, as if trying to solve a puzzle just beyond his understanding. Rain and drought, cotton and frost, the years folded over her like pages too heavy to tear. Josiah grew wealthier, Eleanor more bitter. The plantation expanded, swallowing neighboring lands when smaller farmers failed. More people arrived in chains, their eyes holding the same shock Celia had felt so many years before. She helped them when she could, eased their transition into this life of endless work. Some looked at her with resentment, the head housekeeper with her keys and relative comfort. Others saw the scars beneath her calm exterior and recognized a fellow survivor. On an autumn evening, when the air smelled of wood smoke and frost, Jonas slipped her another letter during the confusion of harvest supper. She hid it in her apron pocket, fingers tracing its edges throughout the evening as she directed the clearing of tables and washing of dishes. Only later, in the privacy of her small room off the kitchen, did she unfold the rough paper. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged by sea spray, or perhaps tears. Word comes from the north that 3 who share your blood have found places in a cobbler's shop, a printer's, and a schoolroom. They remember nothing of the South but carry your strength. Your blood lives free. There was no signature, no names she could match to the faces in her memory. But it didn't matter. 3 of her children, perhaps the oldest ones, the first torn from her arms, breathed free air, learned trades, perhaps even learned letters. Outside her window, a storm gathered. Wind bent the trees like supplicants, and the first heavy drops of rain struck the glass. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating her small room, the narrow bed, the single chair, the small box beneath the floorboards where she kept her treasures. A baby's tooth, scraps of cloth from childhoods she never witnessed, these precious letters. Thunder growled across the sky as she pressed the paper to her lips, tasting the salt of tears, hers or the writer's, she couldn't know. "Your blood lives free," she whispered to herself, the words becoming a prayer, a promise. "Then I can live, too." The storm raged outside, but within her, something quiet and determined took root. She carefully refolded the letter and placed it with the others beneath the floorboard, then sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the rain and thinking of cobble shops and printing presses and schoolrooms far to the north. Morning light spilled across the polished floor of the main hall as Celia directed the day's cleaning. William, now 15, worked diligently beside her, his slender fingers moving the dust cloth in careful patterns across the mahogany side table. As he worked, a soft melody escaped his lips, a gentle humming that filled the quiet space between them. Celia's hands froze mid-motion. The tune floated in the air, familiar as her own heartbeat. A lullaby Miriam had taught her years ago, one she had sung to each of her babies before they were taken. The notes were slightly different, but the melody unmistakable. "Where did you learn that song?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William looked up, startled. I don't rightly know. Old Miriam used to sing it when I was small. Before she— He trailed off, his eyes dropping back to his work. Miriam had been gone since winter. The old midwife had passed quietly in her sleep, leaving Celia without the one person who had been mother, teacher, and friend to her. The plantation felt emptier without her wisdom. It's a pretty song, Celia said carefully, resuming her work. My mother sang something like it, long ago. William smiled, the expression transforming his solemn face. Feels like I've known it forever. Because you have, Celia thought, her heart aching. I sang it to you before you could open your eyes. Throughout the day, the song followed her. She heard it in the creak of floorboards, in the wind through the trees, in the clatter of dishes being washed. It was as if Miriam herself had orchestrated this moment, pushing Celia toward a truth she had hidden for too long. That evening, after the main house had settled into silence, Celia slipped out to the small cabin where William and Henry slept. The moon cast long shadows across the yard as she made her way between the buildings, her steps practiced and silent. She tapped lightly on their door. William opened it, surprise evident on his face. Miss Celia, I need to speak with you both, she said. May I come in? The cabin was spare, but clean. 2 narrow beds, a small table, a single chair. Henry sat up, instantly alert, his eyes wary in the dim light of their single candle. Is something wrong? He asked. At 16, his face had begun to harden into the man he would become, his jaw set in permanent defiance. Nothing wrong, Celia said, closing the door behind her, but something true that needs telling. She sat on the edge of William's bed, smoothing her apron with trembling hands. How to begin? The words she had practiced in her mind scattered like startled birds. That song you were humming today, William, she finally said. I know it, because I sang it to you when you were born. Confusion crossed his face. I don't understand. Henry leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What are you saying? Celia took a deep breath. I'm saying that before you were brought to the main house, before you were made to serve there, you were born in a small cabin behind the kitchen. I'm saying I held you both when you first came into this world. Understanding dawned slowly on William's face, but Henry was quicker. You're our mother, he said flatly, not a question. Celia nodded, tears filling her eyes. Yes. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for years. William's expression shifted from confusion to wonder to pain. Henry's face remained hard, but something flickered behind his eyes. Rage or recognition, she couldn't tell. Why didn't you tell us before? William finally asked, his voice breaking. I couldn't, she whispered. They would have sold you south if they knew you recognized me. Eleanor. She made sure the others were sold away before they could remember my face. You two were kept only because Josiah wanted— She stopped, unable to finish. Because he wanted sons near him. Henry finished, his voice bitter. His own blood to serve him. Celia nodded, watching as the truth settled over them like a heavy blanket. I've watched over you as best I could, she continued. Every day, I've seen you and known you, even if I couldn't claim you. William's face crumpled, and he suddenly looked much younger than his 15 years. He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. I'll protect you, he promised, his voice fierce despite its softness. No one will hurt you again. Henry stood abruptly, pacing the small room. Protection isn't enough, he said. We should fight. Run. There are places— Jonas knows of ways north, Celia agreed. He's urged me to go many times. Then why haven't you? Henry demanded. Celia looked at her eldest living son, seeing Josiah's features transformed by her own determination. Not yet, she said quietly. I have roots here that must burn first. Later that night, back in her own small room, Celia knelt before the hearth, where embers still glowed. From her pocket, she drew a small knife, one she had taken from the kitchen years ago and kept hidden. She thought of Miriam, gone since the last frost, taken by a cough that wouldn't heal. The old woman's teachings were all that remained of her now, knowledge of herbs and healing, of poisons and patience. "Guide my hand, old mother," she whispered to the darkness. Carefully, she pricked her finger with the knife's point. A drop of blood welled up, dark in the firelight. She held her finger over a small bowl of water she had placed before the hearth, watching as the blood dropped into the clear liquid, spreading like ink in water. "For every drop they took," she said softly, "I'll take one back." The embers in the hearth shifted, sending up a small flare of light that reflected in her eyes. In that moment, with the blood-tinged water before her and the knowledge of her sons sleeping across the yard, something crystallized in Celia's heart. Not just anger, but purpose. The flame caught the tears on her cheeks, making them shine like polished glass. Hard things, formed in fire. The evening supper bell rang across Marrow Plantation as the summer sun hung low in the sky. Celia moved swiftly through the dining room, placing the final touches on the table. Polished silver gleaming beside fine china, fresh-cut flowers arranged in the center. Eleanor had been gone 3 days, visiting her sister in Savannah, leaving Josiah to dine alone. William assisted her, his movements careful and precise. Since learning the truth 2 weeks earlier, he had stayed close to her, finding small ways to ease her burdens, carrying heavier loads, finishing tasks before she asked. Each gesture was a quiet acknowledgement of their bond. "The master's favorite wine is chilled," William said softly, adjusting a glass. Celia nodded, a small smile crossing her face. "Thank you." The door to the dining room burst open with such force that the china rattled. Josiah Marrow stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger, a gold pocket watch dangling from his fist. "You!" he bellowed, pointing directly at William. "Thief!" William stepped back, confusion etched across his face. "Sir? Don't play innocent with me, boy." Josiah advanced into the room, bringing with him the smell of whiskey and tobacco. "My grandfather's watch was in my desk drawer this morning. Now it's in the stable, wrapped in your shirt." Celia's heart stuttered. "Master Josiah, there must be a mistake." "Silence!" Josiah roared, turning his fury toward her. "Did I ask for your opinion?" William stood perfectly still, his eyes wide with fear. "Master, I never touched your watch. I swear on—" "On what?" Josiah sneered. "Your worthless life? I caught you learning letters from her." He jerked his head toward Celia. "Now you're stealing." "What's next? Running?" Celia stepped forward, placing herself between Josiah and William. "Master, William has been with me all day. He couldn't have—" "Are you calling me a liar in my own house?" Josiah's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. The dining room fell silent. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls. "Please," Celia whispered, abandoning pride. "He's just a boy. If something's missing, I'll find it. I'll replace it." Josiah's laugh was cold. "With what? Your pretty face has faded, Celia. You have nothing left to bargain with." He moved with surprising speed, grabbing William by the collar. "Time to learn what happens to thieves on Marrow land." "No!" Celia reached for William, but Josiah shoved her back, sending her sprawling against the table. Dishes crashed to the floor. "Overseer!" Josiah called, dragging William toward the door. "Bring the whip to the yard." William struggled, his eyes finding Celia's. "Mother!" he gasped, the forbidden word escaping in his panic. Josiah froze, his grip tightening on William's arm. "What did you call her?" Terror washed over Celia as she scrambled to her feet. "He didn't mean it, Master. He's confused." "Mother," Josiah repeated, looking between them with dawning comprehension. His face twisted with rage. "You told him? You dared to tell my houseboy that—" "Leave him be," Celia cried. "Take me instead. Whip me." But Josiah was already dragging William through the door. "This just got worse for you, boy. Much worse." Celia ran after them, her skirts tangling around her legs as she stumbled onto the porch. The evening air had turned cool, but sweat poured down her face. "Henry!" she screamed toward the stables. "Henry, help him!" Across the yard, slaves were emerging from cabins, drawn by the commotion. Jonas appeared from the tool shed, his face grim. 2 white overseers moved to flank Josiah, blocking Celia's path. 20 lashes, Josiah ordered, shoving William toward the whipping post. "No, make it 30, and everyone watches." "Mother!" William cried again, as rough hands tore his shirt away. Henry burst from the stables, his face contorted with fury. He sprinted across the yard, a blur of motion and rage. "Stop!" Celia screamed, lunging past the overseers. "He's your son! Your blood!" Time seemed to slow. Josiah turned, his eyes meeting Celia's. Something shifted in his expression. Not remorse, but a terrible understanding. He nodded to the overseers. "Tie her. Make her watch." Hands grabbed Celia, forcing her to her knees as William was bound to the post. His slender back gleamed pale in the dying light. "Please," Celia sobbed, struggling against the hands that held her. "He's innocent. He's innocent." The first lash fell. William's scream tore through the evening air. Celia fought harder, feeling her skin tear against the ropes. Henry reached the crowd, shouldering through the gathered slaves. "Stop!" he roared, launching himself at the overseer with the whip. The second man caught him mid-leap, throwing him to the ground. Josiah nodded, and 2 more men dragged Henry away, his furious screams echoing across the yard. "Chain him," Josiah ordered coldly. "The Louisiana men will be here at dawn. They pay good money for strong, rebellious ones." The whip rose and fell. William's cries weakened with each lash. Blood ran in dark rivers down his back, dripping onto the packed earth below. Celia stopped struggling. Something inside her quieted. Not surrender, but a terrible stillness. She watched without blinking as her son's life was torn away, stroke by stroke. By the 20th lash, William hung limp against the post. By the 30th, he made no sound at all. Night had fallen completely when they finally cut him down. His body crumpled to the ground like a discarded doll. The crowd dispersed in silence, heads bowed, feet shuffling away from the horror they had witnessed. Celia, released from her bonds, crawled to her son. His face was peaceful now, free from pain. She gathered him in her arms, rocking slowly back and forth. She whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead, "My beautiful boy." Josiah watched from the porch steps, swirling whiskey in a glass. "Clean this up," he ordered, no one in particular, "and keep the other one chained until the buyers come." Before dawn, while the house slept, Celia dug a grave beneath the magnolia tree. Jonas helped her carry William's body, wrapped in a clean sheet she'd taken from the linen closet. They lowered him gently into the earth. "Henry?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Chained in the shed," Jonas whispered. "Guarded. We can't get to him." Celia nodded, her face set like stone as she shoveled dirt over her son's body. When the grave was filled, she knelt beside it, her fingers smoothing the soil. "You took my body," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the distant window where Josiah slept. "You took my children. Now I'll take your name." The first light of dawn crept across the horizon as she stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Her tears had dried, leaving tracks like scars on her cheeks. She looked toward Josiah's lit window, where a lamp still burned. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice steady and cold. "The counting begins." Morning light filtered through the curtains of Merrow Plantation's grand kitchen. Celia moved with calm purpose, her hands steady as she prepared the morning tea tray. The copper kettle whistled softly on the stove. She lifted it with practiced ease, pouring steaming water over the delicate tea leaves in Eleanor Marrow's favorite porcelain pot. 3 days had passed since William's burial. 3 days since Henry had been sold south. 3 days of silence and planning. Eleanor had returned from Savannah the previous evening, bringing with her new lace and perfumes, unaware of what had transpired in her absence. She had retired early, complaining of travel fatigue, leaving Celia to unpack her trunks and prepare her chambers. Now, as the house woke to another summer day, Celia added a spoonful of sugar to the tea, then paused. She glanced toward the doorway, ensuring she was alone, before reaching into her apron pocket. Her fingers closed around a small cloth pouch, one of Miriam's medicine pouches that she'd kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her quarters. For a moment, she closed her eyes, remembering Miriam's weathered hands guiding hers among the plants behind the smokehouse. "This one brings sleep," old Miriam had whispered, pointing to white flowers that bloomed only at night. "This one eases pain." She'd indicated a twisted root. "And this one," her finger had touched a small dark berry, "this one releases the soul when pain becomes too great to bear." "How much?" Celia had asked, her voice barely audible. "For mercy. 3 crushed seeds. For justice." Miriam's eyes had met hers. "The whole berry." Now, Celia opened the pouch and removed a dried, wrinkled berry. She crushed it between her fingers, watching the dark juice stain her skin. Without hesitation, she stirred the crushed berry into Eleanor's tea, the dark flecks disappearing into the amber liquid. She arranged delicate china cups on the silver tray, added a small pitcher of cream, and placed freshly baked biscuits beside a pot of honey. "Everything perfect," as Eleanor demanded. "Everything normal." "Is that the mistress's tray?" Lydia, the young kitchen helper, asked as she entered. Celia nodded, her face revealing nothing. "Yes, I'll take it up now." "She seemed in a mood last night," Lydia said, lowering her voice, "asking about Master Josiah's comings and goings while she was gone." "The mistress always wants to know everything," Celia replied, lifting the tray. "That's why I serve her personally." She climbed the main staircase, balancing the tray with the practiced grace of years of service. Her heart beat steadily, neither racing nor faltering. Outside Eleanor's door, she paused, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Enter!" came the sharp reply. Eleanor Marrow sat propped against pillows, her blonde hair still in night braids, her face pale without its usual powder. At 43, she fought against time with creams and potions, but nothing could hide the bitterness that had etched itself into the lines around her mouth. "Your morning tea, ma'am," Celia said, setting the tray on the bedside table. Eleanor watched her with narrowed eyes. "You seem different this morning, Celia." Celia poured the tea with a steady hand. "Do I, ma'am?" "Yes. Almost. Peaceful." Eleanor frowned. "I heard there was trouble while I was gone." "Something about the boys." Celia handed her the cup. "Master Josiah can tell you about it, if he wishes." Eleanor took the cup, inhaling the fragrant steam. "He's been unusually silent. Didn't come to bed last night." She sipped the tea, then grimaced slightly. "This tastes different. New leaves from Savannah, ma'am." "You mentioned wanting something stronger." Eleanor nodded absently, taking another sip. "What happened to William? I didn't see him this morning." Celia busied herself adjusting the curtains, letting more light into the room. "He's gone, ma'am." "Gone?" Eleanor frowned, her cup halfway to her lips. "What do you mean, gone? And where's Henry?" "Sold," Celia said simply, turning to face her mistress. "Both gone now." Eleanor set down her cup, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Josiah didn't tell me he was selling them." "He didn't tell me when you sold my first child either," Celia said, her voice flat. The color drained from Eleanor's face. "What did you say to me?" "I said," Celia repeated, stepping closer, "he didn't tell me when you sold Joseph, or Mary, or Samuel. My children." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. How dare you speak to me this way? I'll have you. She stopped, gasping suddenly. Her fingers clutched at her chest. What? What's happening? It starts with pressure, Celia said calmly, watching as Eleanor struggled to breathe. Then burning. Then darkness. Eleanor lunged for the bell pull beside her bed, but her limbs seemed heavy, uncoordinated. The teacup fell from the table, shattering on the floor. Help! She gasped, but her voice was too weak to carry. No one will come, Celia said, standing perfectly still. Not in time. Eleanor's eyes widened with understanding. You poisoned. Yes, Celia nodded. The same way you poisoned my hope year after year. Eleanor slid from the bed, her nightgown tangling around her legs as she tried to crawl toward the door. Her breathing came in short, painful gasps. Why? She managed to whisper. Celia knelt beside her, not to help, but to ensure her words were heard. Because you watched. You knew what he did to me. You took my children to punish me for his sins. Eleanor's body convulsed, her fingers clawing at the rug. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she fought against the poison coursing through her veins. You'll see your angels before morning, Celia whispered, her face close to Eleanor's. But I doubt they'll welcome you. Eleanor's last breath rattled in her throat, her eyes fixed on Celia's face with final, terrible understanding. Then, stillness. Celia remained kneeling for several minutes, watching as death settled over the woman who had orchestrated so much of her suffering. She felt neither joy nor remorse, only the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. Rising slowly, she straightened the bed covers, wiped up the spilled tea, and collected the broken pieces of the cup. She placed Eleanor back on the bed, arranging her as if she were sleeping. At the door, she met Jonas, who had been keeping watch in the hallway. It's done, she said quietly. Jonas's eyes were solemn. We should leave now, before she's found. I have a boat waiting at the river landing. We can be gone by nightfall. Celia shook her head. Not yet. There's one more sin to bury. Josiah will kill you when he finds her, Jonas warned. A ghost of a smile touched Celia's lips. No, he won't have the chance. She walked past him, down the stairs to the kitchen. There, she washed the poisoned cup thoroughly, her movements methodical. As she dried it, she thought of Miriam, how the old woman had pressed the pouch of berries into her hand the winter before she died. Not for pain, Miriam had whispered, for justice. When the time comes, Miriam was still teaching her, even from the grave. The knowledge passed down through generations of women who had endured what should never be endured. Celia placed the clean cup back in the cabinet, her face serene. One down, she murmured, looking toward the master's study where Josiah would soon be working. One left. Nightfall came to Marrow Plantation with a heavy darkness. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a storm that had yet to arrive. The house stood silent, mourning in its own way. Eleanor Marrow had been found dead in her bed that afternoon, a tragedy attributed to her weak heart. Josiah had raged, then wept, then locked himself in his study with a bottle of whiskey. Now, as the last light faded from the sky, a servant knocked at his door. Master Josiah? You called for me? Celia's voice was soft, properly deferential. A crash sounded from within, glass breaking against a wall. Enter, he slurred. Celia stepped inside, her face carefully blank. Josiah slouched in his leather chair, his cravat undone, his eyes red from drink and grief. An empty bottle lay on its side near the fireplace. A second stood half-empty on his desk. Fix me another, he commanded, gesturing to the decanter. She poured the amber liquid into a crystal glass, noting how his hands shook when he reached for it. He drained it in one swallow. Did you know? He asked suddenly, his bloodshot eyes fixing on her. Did you know she was ill? No, Master Josiah, Celia replied evenly. The mistress seemed well yesterday. He slammed the glass down. God takes everything from me. First my sons, Now my wife." Celia didn't respond to his blasphemy. Instead, she moved to straighten the papers on his desk, a servant's gesture, harmless and expected. "Leave those," he snapped. Then his voice softened. "Come here, Celia." She approached, stopping just beyond his reach. "You're all I have left now," he murmured, his drunkenness making him maudlin. "You've always been my favorite, my beautiful Celia." "I have something to show you," she said quietly, his eyebrows raised. "What could you possibly have to show me?" "Something I've kept. For us." She backed toward the door. "In the old nursery." Interest flickered across his face. "The nursery? We haven't used that room in years." "I've prepared it," she said, "for tonight." Understanding dawned in his eyes, mixed with lust. Despite his grief, or perhaps because of it, he craved comfort, distraction. "Lead the way," he said, struggling to his feet. Celia guided him through the darkened hallways, up the stairs to the east wing where the nursery had once housed his legitimate children, the ones who'd died of fever long before Celia's arrival. The room had stood empty for years, a shrine to Josiah's first family that Eleanor had maintained but never entered. Celia opened the door. Inside, oil lamps glowed at each corner of the room, their light soft and inviting. The old cradle had been pushed aside, and in its place, a small pallet lay on the floor, covered with clean linens. "What's this?" Josiah asked, swaying slightly in the doorway. "A place for us," Celia answered, her voice steady. "A place for remembering." He stepped inside, drawn by the warmth and her promise. She followed, closing the door behind her. The lock clicked, a sound almost too soft to hear. Josiah turned at the noise, momentary confusion crossing his face. "Did you lock the door?" "Yes." Celia moved to the small table where a familiar leather-bound book lay open. "I didn't want us to be disturbed." He snorted, relaxing again. "Good thinking. Now, come here." "First, I want to read to you," she said, picking up the ledger. "Your own words." Josiah frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Put that down." "Joseph Marrow," she began reading, her voice clear and precise. "Born April 3rd, 1828. Sold November 15th, 1828. Price, $150. The color drained from Josiah's face. "Where did you get that?" "From your study. Your record of every child you bred from my body." She turned a page. "Mary Marrow. Born January 17th, 1829. Sold February 22nd, 1830. Price, $180. "Stop this," he commanded, moving toward her. Celia continued, stepping away from his reach. "Samuel Marrow. Born December 1st, 1830. Sold August 10th, 1831. Price, $200. Her voice never wavered. "Thomas Marrow. Born July 4th, 1832. Sold September 3rd, 1833. Price, $250. "Enough!" Josiah lunged for her, but his drunken state made him clumsy. He stumbled against the cradle, sending it crashing into one of the oil lamps. The lamp tipped, spilling its contents across the floor. Celia kept reading, her voice rising over his curses. "Sarah Marrow. Born March 15th, 1834. Sold October 12th, 1835. Price, $300. "I said stop!" Josiah shouted, regaining his balance. "Did you stop when I begged you?" Celia asked, her eyes hard as flint. "Did you stop when my children cried for me?" She moved to the next lamp, deliberately tipping it. Oil spread across the wooden floor, snaking toward the first puddle. The rich, heavy scent filled the room. "What are you doing?" Fear edged into his voice. "Have you lost your mind?" "I found it," she corrected him. "In this book. In these numbers. In the graves I dug for children I never got to bury." Josiah's eyes darted to the door, now understanding his danger. "Celia, think about what you're doing. I can give you your freedom. Money. Whatever you want. I want my children back," she said simply. "Can you give me that?" She tipped the third lamp. Oil splashed across the pallet she had prepared. "Please," he begged, backing toward the door, trying the handle. "Don't do this. I'm sorry. I'll make it right." "You already did," Celia replied, reaching for the final lamp. "You taught me that everything has a price." She lifted the lamp above her head. The flame flickered inside the glass. "Including you." With a swift motion, she hurled the lamp at his feet. Glass shattered. The flame touched oil, and fire bloomed like a terrible flower, spreading rapidly across the floor. Josiah screamed, jumping back from the advancing flames. Celia moved to the wall, pressing against a panel that swung inward. A servant's passage that Josiah had never known existed, one that Jonas had shown her years ago. She slipped through as Josiah lunged for the door, rattling the locked handle in panic. "Celia!" he roared, his voice breaking with terror. "Don't leave me here!" Through the narrow passage she moved, counting her steps in the darkness. Behind her, Josiah's screams echoed, growing more desperate as the fire spread. The smell of smoke filled the passage. When she reached the bottom, Jonas waited, a cloak in his hands. "It's done," she said, taking the cloak and wrapping it around her shoulders. "The wagon's ready," he replied, leading her through the servants' entrance to where a small cart waited, hitched to Josiah's fastest horse. Behind them, flames began to lick at the nursery windows, dancing against the night sky. Celia climbed onto the wagon seat beside Jonas, her eyes fixed on the growing fire. They did not speak as he flicked the reins, urging the horse down the long drive, away from Marrow Plantation. By dawn, neighbors would see only smoke and ash. They would call it an accident, God's punishment for pride. No one would search for a missing slave woman. No one would know that justice had been served by her own hand. As they reached the river, Celia looked back one last time. The mansion was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the storm clouds gathering above. The great house, where she had suffered for 20 years, was collapsing in on itself, eating away the legacy Josiah had built on stolen lives. Jonas helped her into a small rowboat tied at the landing. As he pushed off from shore, Celia watched the house cave in, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky, bright points of light falling like stars over the ruined plantation. The rowboat skimmed across the black water, the current helping them along as Jonas pulled steadily at the oars. Celia sat huddled at the stern, wrapped in the cloak, her eyes fixed on the orange glow that marked what remained of Marrow Plantation. The flames had risen so high they seemed to touch the clouds. The air around them smelled of smoke and coming rain. A cold wind swept across the river, bringing the first drops of a storm. Celia didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched as 20 years of captivity burned behind her. When they could no longer see the fire, when darkness had swallowed everything but the faint outline of trees against the night sky, Celia's body finally surrendered. She slumped forward, her head dropping to her chest. "Celia," Jonas called softly. When she didn't respond, he guided the boat toward the shore, finding a small cove hidden by willows. He secured the craft and moved to her side. "It's done," he said, touching her shoulder gently. "You're free." Her eyes opened, glassy with exhaustion. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not until we're far away." Jonas nodded. "Rest now. I'll keep watch." She didn't argue. Her body felt hollow, emptied of everything, rage, grief, fear, leaving only bone-deep weariness. She curled onto her side in the bottom of the boat, using the cloak as both mattress and blanket. Above her, through gaps in the willow branches, stars flickered like the sparks from the burning house. Sleep came instantly, dreamless and black. When she woke, pale morning light filtered through the trees. Jonas was still at the oars, his face lined with fatigue but his eyes alert. The rain had passed, leaving everything damp and smelling of wet earth. "We need to move," he said when he saw she was awake. "They'll be searching soon." Celia sat up slowly, muscles aching from the hard boat bottom. "How far did we come?" "Far enough for now," Jonas replied, pushing away from shore. "We'll follow this tributary north, until we reach the meeting point." They traveled all day, stopping only to drink from a small spring and eat the cornbread Jonas had packed. By sunset, they reached a weathered dock extending from a small clearing. A lantern hung from a post, its flame barely visible in the gathering dusk. A tall black man stepped from the trees as they approached. He nodded once to Jonas. "You're late." "Couldn't be helped," Jonas replied, helping Celia from the boat. "This is Brother Thomas. He'll take you to the next safe house." Brother Thomas assessed her with kind but cautious eyes. "Can you walk 10 miles tonight?" Celia straightened her back. "I can walk as far as freedom requires." He smiled then, revealing a missing front tooth. "That's the spirit that gets people north. Come along." That night marked the beginning of Celia's journey, a long path of hidden cellars, attic rooms, and night travel guided by strangers who risked everything to help her. Some were black, some white. Some spoke of God, others of justice. All recognized the fire in her eyes when she said her name. Her true name, not the one Josiah had given her. Summer faded to fall, fall to winter. She crossed rivers on makeshift rafts, slept in barns beneath hay, and once spent 3 days hidden in a false-bottomed wagon crossing through slave-hunting territory. Throughout it all, she carried a small bundle containing Josiah's ledger and a pouch of soil from William's grave. Spring came, bringing mud and rain and renewal. In a Quaker settlement in Ohio, Celia fell ill with fever. For weeks, she drifted between consciousness and dark dreams where William called to her and flames danced behind her eyelids. A Quaker woman with gentle hands nursed her, singing hymns that reminded Celia of Miriam's remedies and wisdom. When the fever broke, the woman gave her news that made her heart leap. A preacher traveling from Kentucky had mentioned a young man named Henry who had escaped a transport to Louisiana. He had made it to Canada, where he'd married and named his newborn daughter Celia. "Your son lives," the woman told her, holding her hand. "Your blood continues." The words gave Celia strength to continue her journey. By late summer, she reached Pennsylvania, where Jonas had arranged to meet her. They spent one night in a small cabin owned by an elderly couple who had been helping runaways for 30 years. "This is where we part ways," Jonas told her as they sat by the fire. "I'm heading to Canada when the thaw comes. You'll be safe here until then." Celia studied his face, lined now with age and hardship, but still holding the quiet strength she had always known. "Why did you help me? All these years?" Jonas was silent for a long moment. "Because you saw me as a man, not just a tool. And because—" he hesitated. "Because I couldn't save my own family. But I could help save you." When morning came, he left her with his blessing and a small knife tucked into her bundle. "Remember," he said as he walked away, "you're Celia now. Not property. Never again property." She stayed in Pennsylvania through winter, working for a widow who asked no questions about her past. When spring arrived, news came that the Fugitive Slave Act had been strengthened. No place in America was truly safe. Celia moved further north, changing her name, blending into free black communities where her story became one among many. Years passed. Wrinkles formed at the corners of her eyes. Gray threaded through her hair. She kept moving, working, surviving, until one day a letter reached her, bearing Canadian postmarks and Henry's careful handwriting. "Mother," it began simply, "I have found you at last." 3 months later, in a small cabin near the Canadian border, Celia sat by the window, cradling her granddaughter. The baby, just 6 weeks old, had Henry's eyes and Celia's determined chin. Outside, wildflowers nodded in the summer breeze, their faces turned toward the sun. "You're the 13th, Celia whispered to the sleeping infant. "The first born free." The baby stirred, tiny fingers grasping at air until they found Celia's weathered hand and held tight. Celia smiled, feeling the strong pulse of life in that grip. As twilight gathered, She rocked slowly, whispering names into the silence. Joseph, Mary, Samuel, Thomas, Sarah. The litany of children she had lost, some to death, most to the cruel commerce of human bodies. She had spent years tracing rumors, following whispers, but most had vanished like smoke. "Some of you I lost," she murmured, pressing her lips to the baby's forehead. "Some of you I freed. All of you live in me." The infant opened her eyes, looking up at her grandmother with a gaze unclouded by fear or ownership. In that moment, Celia felt a weight lift from her chest, not completely gone, but lighter than before. The pain would never leave her. The memories would never fade. But this child would never know the lash, never bear children for a master's profit, never watch her babies torn from her arms. "They tried to make me a vessel," Celia whispered, her voice strong despite its softness. "Instead, I became a legacy." Outside, the last light faded from the sky. Inside, grandmother and child remained, 2 points in an unbroken line, one formed in bondage, one born in freedom, both equally precious, equally human, equally free. I believe stories such as this find us for a reason. If this one touches you, please subscribe. I share a new one every day. In the meantime, there are 2 stories on the screen that are even better.